If you enjoy history and love going on adventures, then you've come to the right place. Hit that subscribe button. Come on in and let's go on an adventure together with the Hagemans.
Hello, welcome back to the second part of the Jamestown Colony briefing. Now I know you all saw the thumbnail and clicked on this to find out if someone was actually skinned alive at Jamestown. The answer is yes, and it was brutally gruesome. But there were far more grisly events that took place as well, and I'm going to talk about them all. Then we will take a trip with the Hagemans to Jamestown Colony, and you will be able to see where everything happened. But first, a quick recap from part 1. If you were to ask most people today if they thought the Native Americans were surprised when the English arrived in 1607, they would say yes. But as you learned in part 1, that simply is not accurate. The Native Americans on the East Coast were very familiar with the Europeans. If you remember, Chief Powhattan's brother, Pocahontas, was captured by the Spanish and lived in Spain for 9 years. He learned the European languages, customs, tools, etc. When he finally returned home through trickery and murder, he taught all he had learned to his fellow tribesmen. When the English sailed up the James River and founded their new colony of Jamestown, they completely underestimated the natives. The English believed these natives were ignorant heathens who knew nothing of the world, when in fact, they knew more about the European cultures than many of the English did. The first governor of the Jamestown Colony was Edward Maria Wingfield. As you learned in part 1, Wingfield was intently focused on protecting the colony from a Spanish attack. Therefore, he had ordered his men to focus on building fortifications along the river's edge to protect from a possible Spanish incursion. He completely underestimated the natives in the region, believing them to be ignorant in the ways of warfare, hence not a plausible threat to them in any way. He did not heed the advice from Captain John Smith when he warned Wingfield not to underestimate the natives in the area. A few days later, what Wingfield thought to be impossible became a reality when the Native American warriors led by Pocahontas launched a well-planned attack at the rear of the colony where no fortifications existed. The only thing that prevented the entire annihilation of the colonists were the cannons aboard the 3 English ships still at anchor at the river's edge. They opened up with several broadsides that drove the warriors back and saved the day for the English. Shortly after this attack, Wingfield was removed as governor and John Ratcliffe took his place. Ratcliffe was a pompous, arrogant man who believed he should have a mansion suitable for a governor, hence he ordered the men to build him one. Keep in mind, the men were sleeping in uncovered pits they had dug in the dirt and mud while being forced to build a mansion for their new governor. Morale was low. Worse yet, the food stores were even lower. Captain John Smith saw an opportunity to kill 3 birds with one stone. As they say, he headed out on a hunting trip to bring food back for the men, which would in turn increase the morale. But he also had a secret mission, and this was a perfect time to act on it. He was tasked with learning the fate of the Roanoke colonists that went missing 20 years before. Things did not go according to the Smiths' plan, though. Shortly after venturing out into the wilderness, he was captured by Powhatan warriors. He was questioned by none other than Pocahontas. Smith later wrote that he greatly impressed them with his compass and other tools, and that he was sure they really liked him. Smith was taken to meet with Chief Powhatan, and this is when he met Pocahontas for the first time. John Smith and the Chief Powhatan reached an agreement. The Indians would trade food for beads and copper. Neither one fully trusted the other, but they did understand the usefulness each could provide. Smith wrote that he did inquire from Powhatan what he knew of the Roanoke colonists, and the chief replied that he had them killed. Smith seemed satisfied with the answer and apparently never brought it up again. It was several months before Smith was able to return to the colony, and upon his arrival he was quickly arrested and about to be hung for abandoning the colony. Only after he explained what had happened as well as the arrival of many native tribesmen accompanied by Pocahontas bringing much-needed food was he released. Once the colonists released Captain John Smith, they quickly turned on Governor Ratcliffe, the very man who ordered them to arrest and hang Smith. The colonists voted Ratcliffe out as governor and installed the next in line, a man named Matthew Scrivener, to take over the governorship. However, almost immediately, Matthew handed the job over to none other than Captain John Smith. And that concludes the brief recap from part 1. Now it's going to get interesting, so buckle up and enjoy the ride, my friends. And if you got the munchies, now is the time to pause me. Grab that popcorn, chips, burgers, hot dogs, soda, or beer, because you're not going to want to miss what happens next. All right, here we go. Under the leadership of Captain John Smith, there was peace between the Powhatan Nation and the colonists. The natives stopped their attacks and began to continuously feed the English in return for beads and their word that they would assist the Powhatans if they were attacked by the Iroquois nation. John Smith ordered the men to stop building the mansion for Ratcliffe and instead help the men build barracks for themselves to get them out of the elements. He ordered and helped build a storehouse and a well. The morale of the men skyrocketed, and things began to really look up for the English. Former Governor Ratcliffe, desperate to regain his honor, informed the colonists that he had decided to sail back with their ships to England in order to procure more supplies for the men, as well as plenty of items they could use for trade with the natives. The following morning, Ratcliffe headed back to England. I personally would assume the men would be rather overjoyed to be rid of him. Things were really coming together for the colonists under the leadership of John Smith. The English and the natives were getting along so well, in fact, that the colonists were allowed to live with the natives in their camps, and the natives were allowed to live with the colonists inside their fort. The men now had fresh water to drink, thanks to the well Smith had them dig. They had sturdy barracks to live in rather than dirt pits, and they had a full storehouse of food. Things were going great for them, but that's usually when the floor falls out from under your feet, and that, my friends, is exactly what happened. And it all started crashing down with a nasty hurricane at sea hundreds of miles away. You see, Ratcliffe was true to his word. He had procured more supplies and tradable items. But that is not all he brought back to Jamestown. He brought hundreds of new colonists, including women, which he knew would delight all the men. However, en route to Jamestown, the fleet of 9 ships ran straight into a hurricane. Several of those ships were heavily damaged and had to sail to Bermuda for repairs. What made this such an issue was the fact that these damaged ships were the ones carrying all the supplies. The ships that made it through the storm were the ones carrying all the new colonists, which meant, my friends, that Jamestown was about to receive hundreds of new colonists and no additional food or tradable items to trade for more food with the natives. Ouch time was coming. Another storm of sorts was beginning to brew inside Jamestown Colony at about the same time Ratcliffe and his 9 ships were hitting the hurricane. Among the colonists at Jamestown was a group of men known as gentlemen. These were the youngest sons of prestigious men, such as noblemen or upper-class businessmen. These men had no inheritance coming from their fathers as they were the youngest, which meant they were cash poor, but they could still claim their family's titles of nobility. To put it bluntly, they were lazy, snobby, stuck-up, arrogant little asses, who believed they could do whatever they wanted because of who their daddy was. They refused to do any type of manual work and would freely take whatever food they wanted while bossing everyone else around. This was, of course, a great irritation for every other colonist at Jamestown, and Captain Smith would have none of it. He gathered every colonist in front of the storehouse, placed a lock on the storehouse door, and proclaimed, "He who will not work shall not eat." As you can imagine, there must have been a slow clap of applause coming from the regular colonists. They must have felt it was about time someone put these so-called gentlemen in their place. However, the gentlemen felt much differently. Not only did they now absolutely hate John Smith, they knew he had broken a cardinal rule in England, and they were going to make him pay dearly for it. You might be asking at this moment, what cardinal rule did John Smith break? It's a great question. Captain Smith quoted the Bible. That's right, my friends. It was illegal in those days to quote any passage of the Bible in England, unless you were a clergyman. John Smith had just quoted 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 verse 10, which reads, "He who does not work, neither shall he eat." Just a few days later, in the middle of August 1609, John Ratcliffe returned to the Jamestown Colony with an additional 300 men, women, and children, but very few supplies as the other half of the fleet. The half carrying all the needed supplies was stuck in Bermuda being repaired from the damage caused by the hurricane. They were not expected to reach the colony until mid-spring of 1610. While John Smith was not at all pleased to see Ratcliffe, there was one who was, a gentleman by the name of George Percy. In Disney's Pocahontas movie, George Percy is portrayed by Ratcliffe's dim-witted dog. Sadly, that is not too far from the truth. Percy and the other gentlemen at Jamestown saw their opportunity for revenge on Smith and informed all the new colonists that Smith had committed crime of heresy by quoting from the Bible. A vote was held by all the colonists to remove Smith as their leader. Smith won the vote and was allowed to remain their leader until his term ran out 3 months later. Obviously, Percy was not happy with this, and so he moved to Plan B. He used a play out of his father's playbook. I'll give you a hint.
Remember, the 5th of November.
Does that ring a bell, my friends? I'm talking, of course, about the infamous gunpowder revolution of 1605. The plan was to blow up the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament on November 5, 1605. However, on the evening of November 4th, a man by the name of Guy Fawkes was discovered guarding 36 barrels of gunpowder, enough to reduce the House of Lords to rubble. He was quickly arrested. Most of the conspirators fled from London as they learned that the plot had been discovered. They were soon captured, however. At their trial on January 27, 1606, 8 of the surviving conspirators, including Fawkes, were convicted and sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. George Percy's father, Henry Percy, was imprisoned in the Tower of London from 1605 to 1621 on suspicion of complicity in the gunpowder plot. So, what does this have to do with Jamestown, or George Percy's revenge? Well, the very next afternoon, Captain Smith was relaxing in the late afternoon, stretched out in a canoe on the James River, when out of the blue, his gunpowder satchel he wore around his waist exploded, nearly killing him. The finger was pointed at Percy as the likeliest of suspects, but in an attempt to keep the peace. Smith, severely wounded and near death, told the colonists it was an accident. It was determined by the colonists that the best chance for Smith's survival was to return to England. The following morning, Smith was carried onto one of the ships, and they began their arduous journey back home. And guess who the next in line for governor of Jamestown was? Yep, you guessed it. None other than George Percy. Now George, in all his infinite wisdom, looked at the situation at the colony. John Smith was on his way back to England and would probably die en route, so he would no longer be an issue for Percy. However, they now had hundreds of new colonists to feed, and no extra supplies to trade the natives for more food. Worst of all, winter was coming. Percy knew they needed a great deal more food. After looking at the entirety of the situation, Percy came to the brilliant conclusion that they would simply just take what they wanted. After all, the natives were inferior to them in every way and would not be able to mount any type of real resistance to them. He therefore instructed his friend and former governor, John Ratcliffe, to take a company of men out to the various villages and take all the food they could find. Ratcliffe was more than happy to oblige. After a few raids had taken place, and after learning that John Smith was no longer at Jamestown, as some of the colonists had told Pocahontas he had died, Chief Powhattan realized the political arrangement he had with Smith was now over. He knew it was a whole new game, designed to severely tip the scales in favor of the English. He could not allow his tribes to be subjected to these ruthless attacks that left them with no supplies for the upcoming winter. The chief was more than angry. He wanted payback. The chief called a tribal meeting to discuss how best to deal with Ratcliffe and the raids he had been leading against their tribes. He made it clear, in simple terms, what he wanted to happen.
I want him dead. I want his family dead. I want his house burnt to the ground.
A message from the chief was sent to Jamestown, stating that they were willing to give a large amount of food to Ratcliffe if they would stop the attacks. They set a meeting point near the Paspahegh village, 8 miles from Jamestown. George Percy and Ratcliffe were overjoyed. They had finally showed those Indians who the boss really was. And now they would have all the food they needed. Ratcliffe and his 25 men arrived at the designated area, excited to assert their dominance and retrieve the much-needed food, but they were in for a nasty surprise. Powhatan warriors en masse were waiting for them and took them prisoner. They immediately executed 24 of Ratcliffe's men, leaving one alive to tell the story. They then tied Ratcliffe to a tree and started a small fire a few feet away from him. Then they called their women in to finish the job. The women came prepared with mussel shells, and starting at the top of Ratcliffe's head, they began to slowly and methodically skin him alive. Throwing each piece of skin onto the fire, the lone survivor, Captain William Pettiplace, reported to Percy, upon his return to the Jamestown Colony, that every time Ratcliffe passed out from the brutally agonizing pain, they would wake him back up and start again. But if Percy and the colonists thought this was the worst the natives could do, they were in for one hell of a surprise. Chief Powhatan knew a couple of things for sure when it came to the English at Jamestown. 1. The natives stood no chance in a flat-out assault of the fort because of the English cannons. 2. The English desperately needed food, which meant their food stores were low. If he could not kill them outright in an attack, he would kill them in a slower and more agonizing way and without placing his warriors directly in harm's way. Powhattan would lay siege to the colony. He would ensure his warriors stayed far enough from the fort walls so that the cannons were ineffective and useless. And when the colonists tried to go out hunting for food, his warriors could kill them at their leisure, and with winter nearly upon them, it was a surefire recipe for an epic nightmare for the English. What follows, my friends, is perhaps the most brutal and agonizing time in the colony of Jamestown's history. At the time Powhatan began his siege of Jamestown, there were 500 colonists living in the fort. It took very little time for them to use up what little food stores they had left. So, they sent several small hunting parties out. None ever returned. They began to slaughter their horses one at a time, only eating enough to sustain life. But they only had a few horses and they did not last long. They next slaughtered their dogs, but that only got them by for a few more days. Thankfully, there were plenty of rats to munch on, but they made their way through them as well. When there was no more animal meat to eat, they began to cook their shoe leather. Unfortunately, as you may have guessed, they did not have an endless supply of shoes. Eventually, all but one food source had been used up. It is unknown exactly when the colonists put each other on the menu. George Percy did not include that meat substitution in his journal, and for obvious reasons. I'd like to think that they did not start knocking each other off just to grill out a tasty Larry burger. Even more horrifying is that they perhaps drew lots to see who the next course would be. It makes it somewhat more palatable to think that they simply used those who had just passed away. I know what you are about to ask me. If George Percy did not write about the colonists being placed on the menu, how do we know that Larry made great burgers? We know from the skeletal remains found in their subsequent study by forensic scientists. Here is a small clip of a skull belonging to a 14-year-old girl.
We have the partial skull of a girl that's 14 years of age. With this, we have multiple chops to the forehead. These are tentative chops. Don't do a lot of damage. On the back, we have deeper chops that actually split the skull open. We also have a puncture made with probably a single-bladed knife that is used to pry open this side of the skull.
And through the work of forensic facial reconstruction by an anthropological artist, we now are able to see what this young 14-year-old girl looked like before she was so savagely cut apart and eaten. What's worse was that she was not even given a Christian burial. Rather, her skull was tossed in a trash pile and lost to time before an archaeologist uncovered her. Out of the 500 colonists living at Jamestown at the start of winter 1609, only 60 survived until spring, when the resupply ships that were forced to sail to Bermuda for repairs finally arrived. When the supply ships arrived, they were full of foodstuffs. 150 more colonists and 2 men who would become very important in Jamestown's history. The first of these men was John Rolfe. This gentleman had somehow acquired Spanish tobacco seeds, which was illegal to possess unless you were Spanish and had a permit for them. Spanish tobacco was smooth and enjoyable, hence was sought all throughout Europe. English tobacco was coarse and very unpopular. The second of these men was named Thomas West, Lord de la Warr. Thomas was a general and came to take over the governorship of Jamestown. When he saw the 60 emaciated survivors come out begging to go home, he knew what had to be done. Lord Delaware called a meeting with the 60 survivors and the newly arrived 150 colonists inside the church. He stood at the altar and said 2 words: Irish tactics. Every colonist knew exactly what he meant. Lord Delaware was declaring war and intended to use the guerrilla-style tactics the Irish used against the English in their last war. He immediately took over as governor of Jamestown, ordered all cannons on the ships to be readied, and sailed them as close as he could to the Paspahegh village and opened fire with such ferocity that the entire village was wiped out, thus beginning the First Anglo-Powhatan War. During the next 5 years, the war raged on. Lord Delaware employed scorched earth tactics against the Native Americans. His troops raided villages, burned houses, torched cornfields, and stole provisions. On top of all this, they had captured Pocahontas and tried to ransom her for the Englishmen being held as prisoners by Powhatans, as well as large quantities of corn. They were surprised the chief did not accept the offer. From the chief's point of view, he could not trade all the prisoners plus massive amounts of corn for one hostage, even if it was his daughter. Therefore, the English kept her at the fort. She lived with the English, not as a prisoner but more as one of them. She was taught how to read and write, as well as how to behave as a proper English lady. It was Pocahontas who taught John Rolfe how to plant the tobacco seeds using fish to provide the nutrients for the seeds to produce large crops of tobacco. They became very close, and romance blossomed. The timing could not have been better. Both the English and the Powhatan nation were weary of this war and looking for a way to end it on terms beneficial to each of them. John Rolfe approached the leadership at Jamestown and asked for permission to marry Pocahontas. They were ecstatic and sent word to Chief Powhatan asking his permission for the marriage. Both sides happily agreed. Pocahontas was baptized and given the Christian name of Rebecca, which had to be done before the marriage took place. On April 5, 1614, Pocahontas and John Rolfe stood on the exact spot in the church where Lord Delaware stood 5 years prior to declare war and were married. The First Anglo-Powhatan War was over, and there were several days' worth of celebrations. 2 years later, John Rolfe, Pocahontas and their 1-year-old son Thomas sailed for England in the hope of helping to raise more money for the colony. While in London, she met with the royal family, including King James, and she had her portrait done. It is the only known portrait of Pocahontas. While touring London, Pocahontas began to grow ill. It was believed at the time to be caused by the London air, so they moved to Brentford, though today historians believe she had contracted tuberculosis. While at Brentford, Pocahontas was visited by a long-lost friend, Captain John Smith. In his memoir, Smith wrote that it was a difficult meeting as she had believed him to be dead. On March 21, 1617, Pocahontas passed away and was buried at St. George's Church in Gravesend, England. She was buried in an unmarked grave and no one knows for sure exactly where she lays. A statue of her has been placed in the general location of where she is believed to rest. John Rolfe left his son Thomas to be raised in England by his brother Henry so that he could receive a proper education. John returned to Jamestown and grew his tobacco plantation. It was this tobacco that proved to be the cash cow England was looking for and created the funds the Virginia Company needed to start new colonies, such as the next one at Plymouth, Massachusetts. John passed away in 1622, never seeing his son again. Thomas did make the journey back to Jamestown in 1635 and raised a family. And this, my friends, concludes the first chapter of the history of the Jamestown Colony. There are so many more chapters in this story. If you found this interesting, you will be amazed at what happens next, so I urge you to research it. But for now, let's travel with the Hagemans and see where this story actually unfolded. I will add this one final thought that Matt asked me to pass on to you. If you fancy a trip to Jamestown yourself, do not attempt to go in August. The humidity is absolutely horrible. While the Hagemans were excited to be there, the heat made it nearly unbearable. The Hagemans headed out at 1 a.m. on August 14th, reaching the first stop at 3:30 a.m. in West Virginia.
Well, hello, Darby. What time is it?
3:30.
3:30 in the morning. And where are we?
West Virginia.
We're in West Virginia at a rest stop here. We had to use the restroom and take a little bit of a break. But we are making good time, aren't we?
Mm-hmm.
And where are we going?
The Outer Banks.
To what?
The Outer Banks.
Outer Banks. But where are we stopping first? Jamestown.
Jamestown?
That's right, Jamestown. I kind of had to help you there for a second, didn't I?
Well, I didn't know where we were going. I didn't know if we were going to Jamestown or Yorktown first.
Jamestown first. You're a little tired, aren't you?
No, not really.
Not really? All right. Well, we will come back with some more video a little later. Darby, say bye.
Bye.
After driving several more hours, they reached the first rest stop in Virginia and pulled in to stretch their legs for a bit. About 40 minutes further down the road, they stopped for breakfast at Cracker Barrel.
Well, hello, Darby. Where are we right now?
We are in Virginia.
Virginia. And how far are we from Jamestown?
3.5 hours, I think.
Yep, 3.5 hours. And what time is it right now? It's about 7:30. We've been driving all night and we finally just got into Virginia. And let's show you around a little bit here. We're at a rest stop. It's really pretty. Oh, here comes Mama. There's Mama. There's the mountains up here. I'll get some better video when we come down. It's a beautiful morning. Here's Mama. Mommy's a little tired. Mom and Darby are sleeping in the car. I've been driving the last couple hours. Uncle Rob was sleeping. And hi, sweetheart.
Hi.
You know where we are?
Yeah.
In Virginia.
Yeah. This is kind of hilly.
There's Uncle Rob up there by the car. I'll get some video of him here shortly. Do you want to get your picture with the love sign that back there?
Oh, I don't know if my hip can handle walking all the way up there.
All right. I'm gonna walk down. I'm gonna walk down this way. There's Uncle Rob. Oh. It has been a long trip so far.
Yes, it has.
We are about 90% there. 3.5 hours away.
Yet fun.
Ah, I know it. Here's all the mountains back there. They're gorgeous. I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this fog if you can see it.
Ooh, spooky.
Whoops, went too far. There we go.
But it'll be spooky if it was nighttime.
All right. Well, we'll make some more videos soon.
Once they had filled their bellies, they headed out to complete the last few hours' drive to Jamestown when the Serpentine Belt broke. It was Saturday, early afternoon. Most auto shops were closed. Matt made a few calls and found one still open, but about to shut down. Shackelford's Auto Repair in Williamsburg, Virginia. The mechanic named Bobby told Matt he was about to close for the weekend, but did not want them to get stranded, and he told them to bring the car in. Once the Hagemans arrived, Bobby brought them out some water since it was so hot and humid, replaced the belt, and then said he was not going to charge them a thing. It was on the house. Matt and Rob were amazed at Bobby's kindness but could not accept. They paid the amount for the belt, his time in fixing it, and a nice tip for helping them out. 30 minutes after leaving Shackelford's, the Hagemans arrived at Jamestown. This is where I will leave you now to enjoy the videos and pictures Matt took of the family. I hope y'all enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit that like and subscribe button. I will see you on the next video.
So, we are coming into Jamestown. The regular town is back here, but the original village is back here, and we have to come over this bridge to get to it. Now, this is all a swampy area. I know I'm walking a little funny, but you can take a look here. It's all swamps, which they didn't see when they got here in 1607 because of a massive drought. They thought it was a perfect location and had no idea that a swamp was going to form. And what do you get with swamps? Mosquitoes. And they carry malaria, and there was no cure for that back then. No medicine for it. It was a killer. But we'll get more into that later. We're heading over to the village, and you can see it way off there in the distance. We'll be back later with more videos. There's Mommy waving. Uncle Rob moving his way on up there. So we are at the tower monument that was built in 1907 to commemorate the 300th anniversary of Jamestown. There's some interesting facts about this. Is they didn't know where the original fort was, but where they built it was actually really close to the main gate of the original fort. It's very big. So this is the view of the James River. This is exactly what they would have seen in 1607, albeit the river is much wider now. This is the original wall. Well, it is exactly where the wall stood and built exactly the same way that they built it in 1607. But the question is, like with the swamp I showed earlier, why would they build it in an area like this? Well, it's not a very difficult question to answer. The Virginia Company that sent the men over had 4 specific guidelines for the English when they came here. First of all, it could not be on the ocean because the Spanish were patrolling that area. And they wanted to keep their men alive because their goal was for their men to find gold and silver and jewels to make them the rich, to make the Virginia Company rich. So they wanted to keep the men alive. In order to do that, they had to stay away from the Spanish. Now, that's why they came here. Part of the reason, the first reason. It was 37 miles from the ocean. It took them 3.5 weeks to sail from Virginia Beach to here. Second reason they picked this site. The Virginia Company said it had to be defensible from every angle. And as you see, an original cannon, well, a replica of an original cannon, and from every corner that you can see, completely defensible. As well as in the back here, it's an island. So you could completely defend this area. Third reason they chose this site, they were told by the Virginia Company that it had to be the highest plateau that they could find in the area. And this is the highest plateau in the area. The fourth guideline they had to follow was there could not be Native Americans living in that area. They didn't want there to be a conflict. And as it happens, Native Americans did not live in this area. Why? For one, the swamp. 2, the river water is brackish, which means it's a mix of salt water and fresh water with all the other bacteria. Oh, you could drink it, but not in large amounts. This area was great for wildlife and for hunting. And the Native Americans, which were the Powhatans and the Algonquins, were on this island over here and that island over there. And they would come to this island to hunt and then return because they believed that this island was not safe to live on. But the English didn't know anything about this and chose this site. And they learned relatively quickly that was a mistake. Well, we will come back to the next lesson shortly. So this is the barracks that was built by John Smith. Well, set up by John Smith. The men built it, but John Smith built it for his men. The first 3 governors here at Jamestown had the men building them palaces, and while the men slept in mud pits. They didn't respect those leaders at all. First thing John Smith does, he comes in and he organizes this. Now, every post that is here, every single one, is exactly where the original one was. And he had the frame, the wooden frame, and it was all built with mud and straw and stone, completely insulated from the rain and from the elements. And the men respected John Smith for this greatly. But we'll come back with another lesson in just a moment. So this is one of the original wells. I'm going to show you right here. I'm going to kind of come up over here. Come on, it goes very deep, but they use these to throw their trash away when they can no longer bring water up. And they found a great many wonderful archaeological finds right there. And we're going to continue our journey. Okay, so this is actually a really interesting place. This was the storehouse. It's actually the place of the first well that John Smith had dug. But this building kept all their food supplies to last them during the winter. But right back in, it was right back in this area where the row houses were, which is where the rich, the wealthy sons of the rich Virginia Company owners lived, and they didn't believe they had to work at all. And they would just walk over and take out whatever food they wanted. but everybody else was rationed and could only get food if they worked for it. Well, when John Smith became governor, he came out here and he put a lock on the door and said, if you eat, you have to work. You work for your food. And that didn't go over very well for them, or for the rich people. They turned against John Smith, although the regular workers loved him for it. And it was just a few months later that John Smith was injured in a gunpowder explosion. And it just so happens that one of those rich sons, his family was involved in a gunpowder explosion and attempted murder in England. It kind of all fits together there, doesn't it? Now, you might be wondering why there are these crosses in the yard with geese all around it. I'm going to tell you the story now. So, in 1607, 1608, 1609, the English were told to hide the numbers of their dead from the Native Americans because they did not want to show weakness. They wanted the natives to believe that they were strong and powerful. And so those who passed away, they buried and then put buildings on top of them. These are all the ones that died. Actually, most of these innocent people died. I guess they were not innocent, but these individuals died during the starving time of 1610. And each cross is exactly where their body was found by archaeologists just a few years ago. But there's one in particular I want to show you. And we're going to try not to irritate these swan too much. And we're going to walk over here to the closest one to the fence. And we are coming up to this one. This one. Right here. Darby, when you come up here, stand up here by this cross. This cross was where the body of a 14-year-old English boy was buried. He was killed during a combat with the Native Americans. They found an arrow lodged in his leg, which created an infection, and his skull had been hit by a club. So they're not sure whether he was killed by the infection or the skull fracture, but he was buried right here. A 14-year-old boy. And you can see with these bricks is actually the foundation of the basements in which, or the foundation of the building floor, the original building floors that were put on top of the graves. So we're going to keep on going, and alright, we just moved over a few steps away from the burial place to the original wall. Well, the replica of the original wall, built in exactly the same spot. But the reason I'm over here is to come over here and show you this. This fort continued way out, about 20 feet into where the river is currently. The river overtook this part of the original fort, and when the Army Corps of Engineers came in 1907, I believe, and shored all this up, they destroyed what was here, not knowing that this is actually part of the original fort. Sad and tragic, but interesting. So we're going to continue. We are walking up, and one last place we have to see and get pictures of is of Pocahontas' statue. The trip wouldn't be complete without a visit to Pocahontas herself. I'm going to get some pictures of her here shortly, but this is Pocahontas, the only known etching of Pocahontas when she was in England. I'll get some pictures of this as well. Now here's Mama at Jamestown, and poor Mama is just suffering something fierce. She's so hot. We're getting ready to go. But what are your thoughts on Jamestown, dear?
It's cool.
It's cool. Darby,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on Jamestown?
I think it's amazing. If it were a little cooler, I'd like to see some more stuff. But
It is very hot. It's about 106 degrees today.
What?
Oh yeah, it's 106. And the humidity is, well, it's the humidity that makes it feel like 106. I'm sorry, it's about 103. Okay, well, I am going to take a quick break. I'm going to run through again real quick and take some extra pictures instead of video, and then we're going to go.